All right, so thank you so much for joining this event, Criminalizing Our Existence. We are so honored to have these panelists with us today. Just a couple of quick reminders about Zoom. If you don't use Zoom too often, or if this is maybe new for you, please make sure that if you're not speaking, that you are muted. And in fact, we really want to give the stage to our panelists for most of this. So please remain muted. When we do the Q&A, please try to drop your questions in the chat. If for any reason you can't access your chat, if you're on a phone and it's tricky or something like that, if you would like to unmute, you may do so during the audience Q&A time. Also, if you want to make sure that the image that is largest on your screen is the person talking, if you go to the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom window and switch to speaker view, that will make sure that whoever is speaking at the time has the main picture. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to introduce our panelists for today. All right. So welcome to our panel, Criminalizing Our Existence. This is co-presented and co-sponsored by the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition and Reproaction. Our first panelist today is Ian Darnell, who serves as a curatorial assistant at the Missouri Historical Society. And Ian was born and raised in St. Louis and holds a PhD from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He has contributed to several local public history projects, including Mapping LGBTQ St. Louis and the Griot Museum of Black History's Impact HIV/AIDS Initiative. And the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition was very lucky to partner with Ian on a lot of those programs at the Griot. He's also helping to develop a major exhibition on the St. Louis area's LGBTQIA+ communities at the Missouri History Museum.
And next up we have Indigo. I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name. Hann?
Hann.
Hann, yes. Pronouns they, them. They're a sex worker and the founder of the Sex Workers Outreach Project in St. Louis, and one of the leaders of the Missouri Sex Work Decriminalization Campaign, otherwise known as the MoHo Justice Coalition. Indigo's approach to sex worker outreach, mutual aid, and legal advocacy is informed by their commitments to harm reduction, trans, racial, and disability justice, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism, bodily autonomy, and prison abolition. And was it in there that you're a member of the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition? If not, they are.
Also up today, we have Devin Hursey, who is an advocate for public health and people living with HIV from Kansas City, Missouri. And he's an appointed member of the CDC and HRSA Advisory Committee on HIV and viral hepatitis. His local and state level advocacy includes work as a peer educator at Truman Medical Center, serving as a board member for Blackout KC, and he is a member of the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition. Devin also serves as communications chair for the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, ambassador for the Henry Kaiser Family Foundation's AIDS campaign, steering committee member of Impact Global Action for gay men's health and rights. So thank you, Devin.
And then last but certainly not least, we have Erin Matson, who's the co-founder and co-director of Reproaction, a national group using bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. Previously, she served as Action Vice President of the National Organization for Women, which is now as well as the editor-at-large for Rewire News. And Erin serves on the steering committee of the American Society for Emergency Contraception and recently completed 3 terms on the NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia Board of Directors.
Great, and now to introduce your co-moderators, the folks who have been speaking this whole time. My name is Molly. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a writer, educator, and organizer specializing in gender sexuality. I'm the organizer for the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition, and I'm also a member of the What Would an HIV Doula Do Collective, a national group that explores the social, cultural, and artistic response to HIV. And I also teach storytelling and public speaking classes at an organization called Campfire.
And I look nothing like this photo. It's just 3 years old. I gotta update that. Anyways, I've spent the last 3 years centering the reproductive justice framework as the Missouri organizer with Reproaction. I'm an educational leader on increasing abortion access, addressing racial health disparities, and ending HIV criminalization in Missouri. So now that we're through that, thanks for your patience. I want to remind everybody that as we go throughout, you can put your questions in the chat box. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that process at this point because we've been online for a minute. And yeah, just want to remind everyone to stay on mute if you're not already officially been muted. Please and thank you. Out of respect for the presenters. And Ian is first up. So if you want to start sharing your screen and get started.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great, okay, well, my name's Ian Darnell, and I'm a curatorial assistant at the Missouri Historical Society. That's the organization that runs the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park in St. Louis, as well as the Library and Research Center on Skinker, which is open to the public. And if anyone wants to do some historical research, I encourage you to visit. At the Missouri Historical Society, I'm working on the Gateway to Pride initiative, which is a project that's working to expand and deepen our coverage of the St. Louis area's LGBTQIA+ history. And we're working toward a major exhibit on the topic that will open in a few years. So I've been asked to offer some historical perspective around the criminalization of sexuality and gender, and that's an enormous topic. So I'm going to zero in on a few key areas. One is the criminalization of cross-dressing, which I'm intentionally putting in quotation marks. Another is the criminalization of same-sex sexual activity. And then finally, the criminalization of queer social spaces. So for each, I'm going to try to, as best as I can briefly, talk about the origins of how those things were criminalized, ways that they were resisted, and how that might lead us to the present day. So, okay, first of all, the criminalization of cross-dressing. So I think that a lot of younger people, and maybe people who aren't part of the community, are surprised to learn that for most of the history of the city of St. Louis, it was illegal per city ordinance to wear the clothes of what authorities considered those of the opposite sex. This originated in the 1840s, and here's the original legislation. And this ordinance remained on the books in one form or another all the way until 1986. So here are just two examples of people who suffered because of this ordinance. One dates to the 1920s, the other to the 1900s, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of other examples of people who were arrested, jailed, and fined because they were masquerading or what the authorities considered cross-dressing. In very many cases, these were people who we would probably consider transgender today. That is, that they were assigned one gender in their childhood, and then at some point cross genders and began living their lives as what they thought of as their more authentic self. So this for generations was a way that the state was able to harass and police transgender people. It was also sometimes used to prosecute performers, but at the time were called female impersonators. Today we might call them drag queens. So how is it resisted? I'd say that one way that people resisted the masquerading ordinance in St. Louis was simply to defy it, to knowingly break the law, to be what they regarded as their true selves. But by the 1960s, there starts to be more formal, organized political resistance. And in fact, efforts to combat the masquerading ordinance were at the very center of the beginning of an LGBTQIA+ rights movement in the St. Louis area. This is probably the most important example of that. So on Halloween night, 1969, a group of 9 people were arrested as they exited the Onyx Room Bar, which was in Midtown St. Louis near the campus of St. Louis University. And shortly thereafter, they were arrested by the police because they were masquerading. As far as the police were concerned, they were cross-dressing. So they were taken to police headquarters downtown and jailed. So up until this point, that's not so different than the sort of thing that had happened many times throughout St. Louis's history up until that point. But what is different about that night is that an organized community resisted. Earlier that year, an organization called the Mandrake Society had been founded to advocate for the rights of homosexuals, as they said at the time. And they sprang into action that night. They gathered at police headquarters downtown, along with some friends of the people who were arrested. They protested and they demanded that the arrested people be released. They also raised bail and got them out of jail by that morning. And then later, the Mandrake Society got an attorney to represent the arrested people, and that attorney was able to convince a judge to drop the charges. So that was a really important spark for LGBTQIA+ political organizing in the St. Louis area. However, the ordinance remained on the books until 1986. What finally got it thrown off the books was legal efforts by the American Civil Liberties Union of Eastern Missouri. The ACLU took up the case of Michael Shreves, who performed under the name of Michelle McCausland. Some people who have gone to different gay bars in the St. Louis area might have heard that name, as well as 2 anonymous transgender people who were only known in the legal records by their initials. The ACLU was able to convince a federal appeals court to throw out the ordinance permanently, and it finally became legal to wear whatever clothes you wanted, regardless of whether the authorities thought that they were those of the opposite sex. So this is a case of criminalization being addressed through personal efforts, through political organizing, and through legal struggles. That takes us to the next historical realm of criminalization, the criminalization of same-sex sexual activity. From the state of Missouri's very first law code, it was illegal to have sex with someone of the same sex. According to the original wording of the legislation, it was the detestable and abominable crime against nature. And it remained on the books in Missouri all the way until the year 2003. Now, what's interesting is that it was actually pretty rarely enforced. And that's in part because if 2 people are having consensual sex, it's typically done in private, and both of those people would have an interest in making sure the police didn't know that that happened. So there weren't often opportunities for the police to see this going on and for these people to be prosecuted. But what this legislation did do was stigmatize people who were sexually active with members of the same sex. And that became a major barrier to LGBTQIA+ political organizing, as in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. Because by coming out as a queer person, as a gay man or a lesbian or a bisexual person or otherwise same-sex sexually active, you were also essentially admitting that you were a criminal. So this was a major area of struggle. And there was a huge setback in 1986 when the US Supreme Court in the Bowers v. Hardrick ruling said that it was actually constitutional for states to ban same-sex sex. Now, what's important about that, though, is that the community sort of used that moment of defeat as a time to organize. So very shortly thereafter, there was this rally at the old courthouse in downtown St. Louis. This is a photograph from that day. They rallied against the Bowers v. Hardrick ruling, and this was one of the largest, if not the largest, public gatherings of LGBTQIA+ political activists in St. Louis up until that point. Also in response to the Bowers v. Hardrick ruling, we see the formation of PREP, the Privacy Rights Education Project, that later evolved into PROMO, which remains St. Louis's main state-level LGBTQIA+ rights organization. And by the way, I love this button from the collection of the Missouri Historical Society. It said whoever wore that was proclaiming that they were a frequent violator of Missouri's legislation against same-sex sex. I appreciate the cheekiness. Anyway, this legislation in Missouri was finally overthrown in 2003 with the Supreme Court ruling in Lawrence v. Texas. Okay, finally, the criminalization of queer social spaces. So, of course, people very often live their identities in community and in shared social spaces. But one of the most powerful ways that the state suppressed queerness for many decades was by making it effectively illegal to run gay or lesbian bars in the St. Louis area and throughout the state of Missouri. This was done in a variety of ways, but one of the principal ways that this was done was through liquor licensing regulation. As you can see here, in order to have a liquor license, you had to refrain from allowing a variety of different kinds of people to congregate on your premises, including female impersonators and what they referred to as degenerate or dissolute persons, which often interpreted to mean queer people. So, of course, gay and lesbian bars were in operation in the St. Louis area and elsewhere in Missouri during this period, but they were always in danger of being raided. The police always could harass their customers or employees, and they often only stayed in business if they provided bribes to authorities. Here's one example from the 1950s of what might happen. There was a simultaneous raid on 3 gay bars in downtown St. Louis that led to the arrests of more than 20 people, both customers and employees of the bars. What's amazing about this incident is that it's very well documented. We have the police reports. We know that the police interrogated the people who were arrested, asked them questions about their private sexual activity and lives, which I'm sure was a very traumatizing and degrading experience for the people who were arrested. But what's interesting is that many of them expressed what we can think of as the beginnings of a political consciousness. They talked about what they thought the police was doing was unfair, how they didn't think that there was anything wrong with what they were doing, that they had a right to gather with other queer people in bars like this. So what finally led to the end of this pattern of queer social spaces being effectively criminalized? This is actually an ongoing topic of research for me. And at this point, I haven't really found a sort of single moment when there was a change in legislation or a directive from City Hall or something like that finally said that gay and lesbian bars should be allowed to remain in business. Maybe it's out there. If anyone has any suggestions, I'd love to hear it. But I think what's more important is the sort of broader cultural shift in the final decades of the 20th century, where the authorities in the city, the elites in the city began to reimagine gay people as being potential civic assets instead of people who are contributing to the decline of urban neighborhoods. This is a great example of that sort of framework. This is from a newspaper called No Bad News, which was a St. Louis-based gay newspaper in the early 1980s. This is from a pride march in the Central West End, and we can see that the marchers are proclaiming that we save neighborhoods. They're arguing that they deserve rights as gay people because they were contributing to the renewal of St. Louis's neighborhoods. And a lot of politicians and authorities in St. Louis ended up buying that message. But what's important to keep in mind is that that was based on a very narrow conception of who queer people were. The presumption was often that they were relatively affluent, generally that they were white, and that they were relatively gender conforming. So that's important to keep in mind when we think about the transformation of LGBTQ politics in the later part of the 20th century. So there's my whirlwind tour of the history of criminalizing sex and gender in St. Louis and Missouri.
All right, thank you so much for staying on time and for the interesting presentation. So, question, if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen. We're talking about the criminalization, bodily autonomy in so many ways, currently and across time. Meanwhile, there's a current national outcry to defund the police. So even if we did defund local police departments, statutes, and ordinances that criminalize bodily autonomy, that criminalize these things, bodily autonomy would still exist, right? So how is the criminalization of bodies connected to policing? And do we need to expand the way that we're talking about defunding the police, like based on the work that you've done?
Yeah, so as far as that very interesting question goes, I want to return to this issue of the history of the criminalization of same-sex sexuality. So like I was saying, that legislation was rarely enforced. We actually have pretty few examples of two consenting adults of the same sex being discovered and prosecuted for violating that statute. But even besides that, even if there wasn't a lot of policing around that particular issue, the law in and of itself still had tremendous power to stigmatize queer people, because it made, just expressing their sexualities, pursuing their desires, wrong, illegal. And that became a major barrier to people coming out to other people on the job, in the political sphere. So I think the lesson that comes from that is that even if a law isn't often or at all put into force in the courtroom, it can still have power to stigmatize. It still has a lot of cultural power.
Molly?
Great, thank you so much, Ian. And I just want to remind folks, as you hear our panelists' brief presentations before we turn it over to Q&A, if questions occur to you, please do drop them in the chat and we can address those at the end. So next, we are going to hear from Indigo Hann to talk about the criminalization of sex work. Indigo?
Thank you. I am going to be pulling up my screen share. There we go. Okay, so I am going to be talking about how the police state, by creating a criminal class, which is deemed disposable, and weaponizing that against sex workers is actually used as a tool to criminalize much larger populations of people that are deemed disposable using white supremacist, transphobic, and cis-sexist logics. And the criminalization of whores actually leads to the criminalization of many targeted and disenfranchised populations within the United States. So one of the freedoms that these laws that criminalize sex work primarily target is freedom of movement. And I'm gonna go through kind of some history of various laws starting since basically the inception of this country that have been used to restrict freedom of movement and migration into the country. So this starts with the Page Act, and that's supposed to be 1785, not 1985, which used white anxiety surrounding Chinese migration to the US to both like reinforce criminality of sex workers and then use the moral panic around sex work to reinscribe the inherent imagined racial criminality of Chinese people to bar access to the country. So essentially, white folks were like, Chinese people are coming, we got to do something to stop this. All Chinese women must be prostitutes, and this is a threat to the white purity of our population. So we got to make sure that they don't come here. So essentially, they use the logic of like, whores are bad, so we need to stop whores from coming here, to actually violate a treaty that we had from China, and bar Chinese women specifically, or other folks of Mongolian races to enter the country. And so this actually marks the end of open borders in the United States. It was the first federal mandate to restrict entry to the country based on race or nationality, and then created precedent for further statutes to ban or create quotas for entry to the country based on race, ethnicity, sexuality, work status, etc. And this the legacy of this law continues today. A little under 3 years ago, our community lost Yang Song, who was a massage worker in New York who had been harassed, raped at gunpoint by a police officer, and targeted in a number of stings. And in one final sting, she tried to escape the building and tragically fell to her death. Now, in the aftermath of this great tragedy and loss, many things about the ways that NYPD conducts its sting operations, as well as how ICE targets sex workers, transnational sex workers, and uses this targeting as leverage to deport or to threaten and further harass migrant sex workers. So this still is happening today. Chinese and other Asian American sex workers are disproportionately targeted on the coast in these types of raids, and it is a link between enforcing immigration and vice crime within the United States as a justification for limiting immigration. This logic continues to the Mann Act, which literally was called the White Slave Traffic Act, and also used that logic of foreigners are stealing our white women, they're binding them into slavery, and then selling them in prostitution. And essentially, this act was worded in such a vague way to be able to criminalize as many people as possible, and ended up criminalizing a lot of consensual interracial and also extramarital sex, but mainly was used to enforce breaking interracial relationships and protecting white purity in that way. And to this day, we see within many anti-trafficking organizations still this idea of white slavery, and this creation of this boogeyman of a racialized, like, trafficking male pimp that is coming to take our white women. And that is why we need to rally against prostitution, when in reality the creation of racial inequity within this country is actually one of the main factors which make people more vulnerable, especially Black women and girls, to trafficking. And so another freedom which has been targeted by creating this rhetorical proximity between various targeted classes and the police is the freedom to occupy public space. So this has a legacy all the way back to integration, the Committee of 14 just preceding and during the Harlem Renaissance was a squad, a private vice squad, which collaborated with police initially to enforce alcohol permits, but then started looking around, realizing that in a lot of Black-owned bars and businesses, there was racial mixing going on, in the sense that white folks were hanging out with Black folks and having a drink. And this created a lot of moral panic that this is opening the doors, the slippery slope of interracial prostitution, and ended up basically waging economic warfare against Black-owned businesses, revoking permits, changing up the terms of their operation, and basically handing it off onto them that if they don't segregate their social spaces and clean up their bar from potential prostitutes, then they would be shut down. So it was used as a tool of coercion for actually communities to also police themselves, to also identify their own community members as potential whores and therefore potential criminals, and to blame members of their own communities for the economic and police violence waged upon them. The implication today is this is part of a long legacy of the police and also other white business owners creating hostile environments for Black-owned businesses, preventing the creation of the generation of wealth within Black and other POC communities, and which also further reinforces the heightened vulnerability of non-white minorities to trafficking. And then very quite literally, in restricting freedom to public space is the walking while trans ban, which is active in New York and basically allows police to stop and frisk anybody who looks suspicious for being a sex worker out in public, and any area that you're occupying out in public that isn't like basically a bus stop, right in front of the bus stop, or like public parks, you could be subject to being stopped, frisked, turned condoms or other sexual paraphernalia into evidence of you being a sex worker. And disproportionately, this targets Black and Latinx trans people in the city of New York, using transness as a marker of being a sex worker and therefore a marker of criminality and justification for their direct removal from public space. Also, by using condoms and other safer sex materials as evidence for prostitution, it actually disincentivizes and criminalizes sex workers' use of personal protective equipment and other harm reduction measures on the job. And also in that same vein, sentence enhancements regarding HIV, if you are an HIV positive sex worker, you can have your sentences increased from misdemeanors to felonies simply by being a person living with HIV, regardless of if you are using condoms, if you are on antiretroviral therapy, doesn't matter, you can face sentencing enhancements, which then disincentivizes STD testing and treatment among sex workers, because if you know your status, then you can be targeted by these laws. This failure of using sex work criminalization to benefit public health is actually illustrated in St. Louis. In 1870, we became the first city to legalize prostitution, during which time they created certain requirements for registered sex workers to be tested on a weekly basis and to be evaluated by doctors. But ultimately, this just ended up in doctors falsifying a lot of these reports. And so there was actually no benefit to public health and safety. And instead, it just doubly criminalized sex workers who were not able to jump through all of these hoops, pay for doctor's appointments, pay for registration. And it actually just worsened a lot of people's conditions because it was essentially a backdoor criminalization. And finally, the way that this affects us all right now in targeting sex workers is 2 acts, Fosta Sesta in 2018, which caused which basically shifted responsibility for user-generated content from the user to the content hosting platform as a way to take down Backpage and other accessible advertising spaces for sex workers under the guise of we need to stop trafficking. And so ultimately, a lot of sites where sex workers were safely able to screen and do business indoors were taken down, forcing more people onto the streets and in dangerous conditions. And this is actually continuing on today. In March 2020 this year, a bill called Earn It was introduced into the House to further prevent trafficking of children. And it takes the step of FOSTA SESTA even further by not only holding content hosting platforms responsible, but actually holding internet service providers responsible for content transmitted through their service, which also will essentially create an opening for the end of encryption, which would have serious ramifications for grassroots organizing, for sex workers to be able to operate their business safely, amongst a whole other slew of issues that would present for that, and censoring user-generated content. And that's for the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you. So you can stop sharing your screen so we can see your face and break it up a little bit. So one question that we want to pose to you, Indigo, before we move on to our next piece. So early in your presentation, you addressed how anti-sex work laws were adopted and acts were passed to preserve white purity. So fast forward to today, what does saviorism, particularly white saviorism, have to do with these topics? And how do we change the narrative to center empowerment of sex workers rather than trying to just swoop in and save people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that right now there's, in the moment of sex work decrim, and there's a lot of rhetoric on sex worker empowerment and listening to sex workers and how do we empower sex workers. And a lot of what has been happening is uplifting the voices of happy hookers, which are often middle to upper class white cisgender women, about how great sex work is and how empowering it is, which it can be, but I think in this moment, we need to really take the time to look at who is most marginalized in our community, which tend to be migrant sex workers, Black and Latina trans sex workers, undocumented sex workers living with HIV, sex workers who use drugs, and looking at how the factors that might make them not love being a sex worker, but sex work being the best option for them can make sex work somewhat of an empowering experience in the sense that they are able to provide for their own immediate needs. But we need to look beyond, like, is sex work empowering? Is sex work not empowering? And look at the root causes of the material conditions which drive people to engage in sex work under non-optimal or non-like freely choosing conditions. And so instead of being like, oh, we support sex workers, yay, and then not doing anything for the people that are actually most impacted by the criminalization of sex work, actually listening to those people and not just doing a single issue thing, but looking at what are the broader issues of carceral violence, food deserts, capitalism in general that are creating the conditions where sex work isn't a great choice for some people.
Great, thank you so much. And I know I have more questions to ask you for the Q&A, but for now, we're gonna go ahead and turn it over to Devin.
Hello. I'm just waiting for you to pull up the slides. But hey, everybody, my name is Devin Hursey, he, him, his. And thank you for the two really good presentations. I was definitely cheering you both on. So I just wanted to start off with a brief overview of what I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. Shout out to everyone who's on the webinar that is a member of the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition. And another special shout out to everyone on the webinar who's living with HIV. So I'm going to be covering just a little bit about HIV prevention basics, some of the systems. I'm going to help to build a context around HIV criminalization. Then I'm going to attempt to define HIV criminalization to help us really build a concept for what it is. And then at the end, we'll discuss some scenarios. But I also, on this slide, I also want to mention that this presentation is not comprehensive. I definitely have some personal limitations because I'm coming from the perspective of a Black gay man. And although my particular demographic and intersection is among the most impacted by HIV and by the criminal justice system, there are a lot of other experiences out there that I'm not going to be able to do justice to. So we can go on to the next. Okay, so here's my little short slide about HIV prevention. I want to make sure that we're all coming in with some very basic background knowledge of HIV. And I know that the way that our education system is and our access to health literate information, we might have to do some of this level setting. So the bodily substances that are most likely to transmit HIV, or that are responsible for transmitting HIV, or involved in that process, are blood, semen, vaginal secretion, and breast milk. And the common transmission routes are normally through IV drug use, through sex, normally penetrative sex, vaginal or anal, and then oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, but also I wanted to include vertical transmission. It's not as common. That normally involves a mother. We don't want to blame anyone, of course, but it normally involves a mother and child, and that can be through the birth process, even though that's not common at all. Actually, that's been mostly eliminated nowadays. And then also through breastfeeding. And then the prevention options, some of the prevention options that are available right now are condoms, you know, sexual health education as a way to make sure that people are making informed decisions about their sexual behaviors. Treatment as prevention, that includes the use of PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. The drugs that are available for PrEP are Truvada, and what's the other one, Rose? The other one is, what's it called? Dovato. That's right, it's Dovato. And then viral suppression. Viral suppression is when a person living with HIV has taken their medication every day at the same time, and the virus is at such a low level within their bloodstream that the HIV cannot be transmitted sexually. I also wanted to include a little bit about harm reduction strategies. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but harm reduction strategies can prevent HIV transmission. Some of those methods are syringe exchange and clean works. I just wanted to give you a snapshot of some of the communities that are highly impacted by HIV. So when we're having this conversation, we want to think about youth. We want to think about people who use drugs, people who are undocumented, bisexual, transgender, and queer identified people, Black people, and Latinx people. And there are others. And then when we're thinking about people who are impacted, we want to make sure that we're considering the intersections. So in the real world, people are not normally just impacted by one system of oppression. It's normally a number of different things. So when we're talking about Black people, those within the Black community who would be most impacted would likely be Black women and Black men who have sex with men. And that's because they live at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression. Also want to include Black transgender people, Latinx people, women, men who have sex with men, and transgender. Again, not an exhaustive list. Okay, so the communities that I just listed are at high risk for HIV because of what we refer to as the social determinants of health. At somewhere I guess the systems of oppression impact everyone differently, and they impact our access to get what we need to survive. You can think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which are like the basic things that you need in your life to make sure that you're living healthy. So as far as the social determinants of health, where this graphic is listing economic stability, neighborhood and environment, education, health and healthcare, and some of those social community resources. There are a lot of other things that are crucial to making sure that we're able to make healthy and informed decisions for ourselves. I would include like mental health care or strong family relationships. I know I've depended on family quite a bit to make sure that I'm not on the street, but that can look different for everyone. So hopefully, a lot of this is already familiar to most of the people on this webinar. We'll move on. So, HIV does not discriminate, but systems do. I just wanted to use that phrasing so that we can begin to have a conversation about policy and the way that people are impacted differently by HIV policy. So, some of the main ways that that people become criminalized are through well, it's normally when someone makes an accusation that that they've had sex with someone who did not disclose of their HIV status. But there's a much bigger system that these things are playing into. Give me just a second. I'm trying to catch up with my slides. So, for example, I work at a hospital, and as a hospital employee, I'm a mandated reporter. So if I ever hear of a story where someone failed to disclose their HIV status to someone that they are having sexual contact with, technically I'm required to report that, and that could start this cycle of HIV criminalization. Similarly, there's contact tracing, which we all know about thanks to COVID nowadays. Linkage to care, that's another one of those people, the case management, that's another team of people who are mandated reporters and who ask a lot of questions. Retention and care, that's one of your points of care when you're going to see your HIV provider. And like I said, mandated reporting. We can go ahead and move on to the next. Oh, someone clarified Discovy, thank you, as a PrEP option. Okay, so, looks like we consolidated some slides. Okay, so again, having this conversation about systems. This is the HIV care continuum. And this is how we outline the points of care when someone is diagnosed all the way to where they achieve viral suppression. And this further illustrates that, we have a lot of contact with healthcare and with public health that could potentially put us at risk, even though these are the systems that we depend on to keep us alive. So one of the things that I want to stress a little bit more is the surveillance, the contact tracing piece. There's, I believe it's on the next slide. Go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. No, we'll go back, sorry. So right now in this country, we're having a conversation about ending the HIV epidemic and what that means and how it's possible. But one of the pillars, one of the 4 pillars of the plan is a tool called molecular HIV surveillance. And what that means is that we are now able, thanks to advancements in technology, we're able to group people together according to who has a similar strain of the HIV virus. So we're comparing viral RNA to see whose HIV is related, basically. So in a state like Missouri, where you can face up to about 30 years for transmitting HIV to another person, now there is surveillance data that can prove that there's a relationship between your 2 particular strains. Although the CDC tells us every day that you cannot prove directionality. I think there's a few ways around that. For instance, they say person A, you can't tell if person A transmitted to person B and person B to person C, or if person A had contact with person B and person C. I know it's really tricky, but it can be tricky if we're talking about homosexual sexual contact. But if we're talking about heterosexual contact and if we're using that sort of paradigm, it's a little bit, I guess there's a little bit, some context clues that could lead you to assume who had contact with who. But there's a few other ways that we can kind of piece together using the surveillance data directionality, especially when we're talking about, like I said, that contact tracing data. A lot of that is self-report of who people disclose that they have had contact with or sexual contact with. I've even heard of surveillance folks using clinic level data and incorporating that into their molecular surveillance system of course, to use that for interventions to benefit the community, but it really poses a serious risk to people living with HIV. And the reason for that is in the state of Missouri, the law requires the health department to provide the prosecution with any surveillance data that's collected on a person once an accusation has been made. So there's really limited security that we have in our medical records. So we can go ahead and move on. Okay, so HIV criminalization. I took this definition from AIDS United because I think it's really good. HIV criminalization refers to the overly broad use of criminal law to penalize alleged, perceived, or potential HIV exposure, alleged non-disclosure of known HIV positive status prior to sexual contact, including acts that do not risk HIV transmission, or non-intentional HIV transmission. Sentencing other HIV criminal laws sometimes involves involves decades in prison or required sex offender registration, often in instances where no HIV transmission occurred or was even possible. So to that definition, I always like to add to that, like other instances of HIV stigma, frequently advocating against these laws, we'll see like articles written in media that say some pretty terrible things about people living with HIV. We'll see an article about somebody who's spreading HIV in the community. And, you know, like really, I have no reason to know someone's sex life in their health status. Like it doesn't impact me, and it's bad public health. It's not going to benefit the community. And outing someone in that way, you know, it doesn't help anybody. Actually, it makes a lot of people afraid to even get tested in the first place if you're going to be made a mockery of. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so, and just to clarify this point, sorry, something popped up. Just to clarify this point about how a lot of this process is initiated. As I stated before, normally an angry ex-lover will come forward with an accusation against someone else who's living with HIV and claim that they didn't disclose. The one way around that I know of is to have a letter notarized before you have sex with somebody. You know, $40 to get it notarized. But also there's penalties, there's civil and criminal penalties when someone is actually accused and when they're facing charges. The penalties in Missouri are up to 30 years. And that's a Class A felony. That would mean that transmission did occur, and it really just requires little evidence. Really, all they really try to prove is that someone actually has HIV. And there's oftentimes civil penalties. I know in New York, someone is being held, Nushan Williams is being held indefinitely. That means he's just being held until Kumo decides to let him out, because he is definitely, anyway, he's being held indefinitely. And that's for civil confinement. There's, as was mentioned in a previous presentation, sentence enhancements for sex work, and for like fighting prison guards. And then oftentimes people will have to register as a sex offender, and yeah, that's a whole situation there. We can move on to the next slide. So we discussed a little bit about who is most impacted by HIV, but really we should think also about who's impacted by the criminal justice system and by HIV criminalization. It's a lot of the same communities. For example, there's an article that I saw come out, I want to say about 2 years ago, and it talks about cluster growth in Texas among Hispanic men. And I'm thinking, and I'm really wondering, I wanted to ask, you know, public health officials why they chose to write that sort of article in a time where we're seeing a lot of politicism around undocumented people. There's a lot of fighting around whether or not we feel like they should be here, whether or not we should give them access to healthcare, when really it's allowing the issue of HIV to be politicized in a way that it doesn't need to, for one, and it's putting everyone at risk. You know, believing that someone is more likely, I'm sorry, just believing that you're going to get HIV from immigrants in your community is nonsense, for one, and then denying them access to healthcare is putting yourself at risk. So I just wanted to make sure that that was put out there. What this also reflects is those intersectional systems of oppression that we're all facing, well, that a lot of us people of color are facing. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so I went through some of these scenarios in hypothetical terms, but I want to leave you with at least one example. So people living in Missouri, and a lot of us outside of Missouri, are familiar with Michael Johnson. Now, I did not get his permission to speak about his case. He is a friend. I just feel more comfortable getting his permission because I don't like the way that his story was handled often in media. But his story is out there. So he was a young Black gay man, a Black gay college student, and he was accused by, well, it was primarily one partner of transmitting HIV to this young white gay man. And the police decided that they were going to follow his sexual movements, and eventually brought together a few other accusers. And Michael Johnson was then facing 30 years behind bars for this, for doing something that's completely normal. So I think it's outrageous that we expect for young people to just stop having sex the instant that they become HIV positive. It's not realistic. Eventually, Michael got a deal for 10 years, and he's now home and safe. I'm happy to report that. But in the court case, what they used as evidence for him, just to show you that there's really minimal, like, the burden of proof is so low. They used like video stills of his penis to prove that he couldn't have used a condom. It was like outrageous like that. The whole thing was racially coded and very problematic. But there's several other stories like this. The Williams Institute released a report on Missouri and what's going on here in terms of HIV criminalization. And what they reported is that the majority of these cases involve some sort of penalty for assaulting a police officer. And 1 out of every 60 people in the state living with HIV has been impacted by these laws. Also, just something else that I feel like is especially problematic is the law also includes spitting. So if you spit at a person, that's considered some sort of like assault and some attempt to transmit HIV to another person, even though spit is not a route of transmission. And it doesn't matter if that spit actually reaches its target or not. So that means, like, for me, I can't even like spit on the ground. But yep. We can move on to the next slide. I think that next should be our call to action. So I just want to invite everyone to use this link to join the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition or to learn more about the coalition. Hopefully you got something from this presentation.
Well, thank you, Devin, for all of that information. It was a lot. I want to ask you though, even with that, so what is something that most people fail to understand about the criminalization of HIV? So in your work that you do, what's something that most people often fail to understand, or something that they misconstrue?
So I touched on this a little bit, and thank you for that question. I touched on this a little bit, but when you try to have a conversation about HIV criminalization with people who are in healthcare or in public health or the health department or something like that, they'll agree with you and they'll let you know that this is very bad policy. We should not be doing this. Excuse me, but when you're trying to build coalition and trying to take action, you know, they'll support in some ways, but can't really be present. I think that what they should understand is that HIV criminalization is a part of the systems that we're using. It's integrated into the Ryan White system. The law states that the health department itself can file these sorts of reports against people as well. So I think we need to be very realistic that, you know, this HIV criminalization is seamlessly integrated into the public health response for addressing HIV. It's like one of the, it's all the same system.
Thanks. Okay, next up we have Erin Matson, the co-founder and co-director of Reproaction.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you to Ian and Indigo and Devin. I learned so much. So I've been asked to talk about contemporary efforts to criminalize abortion. And I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Arlington, Virginia. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Arrington Max. And a bit about Reproaction. So you all know Eva, but Reproaction uses bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're incredibly proud of our left flank analysis, and we're known for our willingness to hold folks on all sides of the issues that we stand up for accountable, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. And we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. So first, I actually want to share, we run a Stop Prosecuting Abortion campaign. Eva's actually wearing one of our shirts right now, and it's awesome. We produced, in addition to doing direct actions on this in education, we produced roughly a dozen original videos where we did interviews. And let's just start with that. I am going to stop sharing my screen, and Molly, can you play the video for folks?
As far as I'm concerned, they committed murder.
So do you think they should be punished for that?
Of course they should.
Women should be punished for having abortions?
All right, okay, we're done.
Representative Ron Wright once stated as Texas County tax assessor that Hitler made the trains run on time. The good that's being done doesn't compensate for the evil that's being done by Planned Parenthood. So, where does the supposedly pro-life congressional leader stand on punishing women who have abortions?
Yeah, I'm opposed to abortion at any time.
Okay, but do you have thoughts on the woman who gave herself an abortion and was punished? She was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Was she really?
Yeah.
Well, I really can't speak to it since I don't know any details about it.
Okay, well, what if I told you there are 21 cases, 20 states across the United States where people have been punished for giving themselves abortions? Does that concern you?
Of course, because they just killed the baby.
So it doesn't concern you that the person is being sent to prison?
As far as I'm concerned, they committed murder.
So do you think they should be punished for that?
Of course they should.
Women should be punished for having
Absolutely.
abortions?
All right, okay, we're done.
No woman should go to jail for having an abortion. Tell anti-abortion legislators to put down the handcuffs at reproaction.org.
Okay, so I just want to be clear that that's a sitting member of Congress, and that's what we're up against. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on behind the Stop Prosecuting Abortion campaign that we're running. So though abortion is legal, people who end their own pregnancies and those who assist them risk unjust arrest and jail time. This is a gross violation of people's human rights, and along with the other things that we've been discussing today. Abortion, this happens in a context where abortion has been stigmatized, made unaffordable, and pushed out of reach by politicians who have passed more than 400 restrictions on abortion since 2010, making abortion unaffordable and shutting down clinics. And I know in Missouri, you're very familiar with bananas abortion restrictions and attempts by politicians to shut down clinics. This is taking place in a context where people are ending their own pregnancies with all of these restrictions on abortion. These restrictions on abortion affect people of all backgrounds, yet they fall hardest on those who are most marginalized and likely to face financial and logistical barriers to care. So to make that explicit, we're talking about people of color, we're talking about young people, we're talking about undocumented people, we're talking about trans people, and poor people. Interrogations and criminal prosecutions don't stop abortions, but they do unnecessarily harm people, invoking fear in those seeking abortion and restricting access nationwide. So what is self-managed abortion? I want to back up and just make sure that folks understand what I'm talking about when I say what self-managed abortion is. Self-managed abortion occurs when a person chooses to do their own abortion outside a medical setting. So rather than going to an abortion provider or a hospital or a reproductive health care center, a person attempts to end their pregnancy on their own. There are a variety of methods that people use to end their own pregnancies, and at Reproaction, we're very clear that no method should be stigmatized or shamed, or and certainly nothing should be criminalized. But I just want to cover some of the more common methods are medication, mifepristone and misoprostol taken together, or just misoprostol taken alone, herbs, manual aspiration, and there are other methods as well. Our campaign at Reproaction focuses primarily on self-managed abortion with pills, primarily the use of misoprostol only, which is about 85% effective when taken using the World Health Organization protocol. We also cover the misoprostol and mifepristone combo, which is slightly more effective, but it's less easy for people to get their hands on mifepristone, and 85% is pretty good, especially when it can be repeated if it doesn't work the first time. Medication abortion is safe and effective. I want to be very clear about that. And data from countries where abortion is entirely or extremely restricted shows that people who can become pregnant have been able to use the drug safely and effectively on their own. And there's reams of data from overseas, from countries like Ireland. We also know that medication abortion is safe and effective here. What it has been, these drugs have been approved. We're about to celebrate the 20-year anniversary of mifepristone being approved by the FDA in the United States. So like I said, self-managed abortion with misoprostol is 85% effective. The miso combo is 95% effective. This is really, really, really important when we're talking about criminalization. The treatment for the complications of self-managed abortion with pills is exactly the same as treatment for complications of miscarriage or spontaneous miscarriage. There are no blood tests that can detect whether a person has used misoprostol pills. Therefore, there is no reason for a person to tell a medical provider that they have an self-induced or self-managed an abortion using misoprostol that they've taken on their own. To date, there have been at least 20 arrests of women in the United States who have ended their pregnancies outside of a medical setting. If a person tells a provider that they have taken misoprostol on their own, they may be putting themselves at legal risk. And in fact, people have been unjustly imprisoned in a gross violation of their human rights for doing so. So how do people get criminalized for self-managed abortion? So there isn't like one easy law that I can point to. There are 38 states with fetal homicide laws in the book. Sometimes those are used. Sometimes there are statutes about that are used to prosecute people who've self-managed abortion that have to do with disposal of remains. There's a variety of different laws. The point is that the laws that can be used to charge people with a crime for self-managed abortion are complex and vary from state to state. But we're looking at laws that directly criminalize self-managed abortion, laws that criminalize harm to fetuses, and criminal abortion laws that are misapplied to people who end their own pregnancies. I want to be very clear too, and just expand the scope of the discussion a little bit. When we talk about laws that criminalize harm to fetuses, we're not just talking about anti-abortion, we're also talking about criminalizing pregnancy, period. And no one should be prosecuted for their conduct during pregnancy. And that includes things like drug use, that includes pregnancy outcomes. So if someone has a miscarriage or a stillbirth, it's all part of a continuum. Regardless of what law is used to criminalize self-managed abortion, if a person is prosecuted, it's really about prosecutorial discretion determining whether a person will be charged. And this renders the discussion of who is criminalized especially important, because this is not race and class neutral. One of the things I appreciate so much, Molly and Eva, is that this entire discussion is titled Criminalizing Our Existence, because it really is about certain people's existence versus behavior. Abortion, in this case, or pregnancy outcomes is a smokescreen. This is really about targeting certain people to criminalize them. I want to highlight two recent Virginia cases where I live, where things have gone horribly wrong. In 2016, a Virginia woman sought emergency medical care after she had a stillbirth at home. Miscarriage is incredibly common, and no one should be afraid of what the state's going to do if you have a miscarriage. But here in Virginia, that is a concern. The treating physician called the police, triggering a criminal investigation of the woman, prosecution, and jail time. And not only did this happen, then one of the newspapers in our Commonwealth published a photo of her that looked like a mugshot, talking about this. She was charged with concealing a dead body, a felony carrying a 5-year prison sentence. She was later pardoned by the governor of Virginia. There's something I want to underscore about this. This happened while Virginia had a governor who was considered a pro-choice champion, as well as an attorney general who was considered a pro-choice champion. Virginia's political composition has been shifting, but I want to be very clear that this problem of criminalizing pregnancy, period, is happening around the nation, and it's not simply a red state problem. In another case I want to highlight, in 2017, a Virginia woman was accused of self-managing an abortion in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. She was arrested on felony charges of producing abortion or miscarriage. In 2018, after far more lobbying than should have been required to have that happen, the prosecution voluntarily dismissed the case. So I will not go deep into this. You can look at this on your screen, and I want to really lift up the leadership of Veronica Bayadi-Flores at the Center for Advancing Innovative Policy. At Reproaction, we work with a number of organizations on criminalization of self-managed abortion. And what she led is really a bigger way of looking at criminalization of reproductive autonomy, that it's so intersectional, right? That there are so many different pieces that lead to criminalization of specific people, targeting reproductive autonomy. And so I want to lift this up and share that. So in terms of, I think we're running close on time, so I want to keep us moving, but solutions. First and foremost, acknowledging that the true issue is of criminalized people rather than criminalized behavior. The problem here is not abortion. The problem is not self-managed abortion. The problem is not pregnancy. The problem is that we are in the middle of using mass incarceration as a tool to target people of color specifically, and abortion and pregnancy gets caught up in that. And so this actually isn't about abortion, although it is in the sense that people are being targeted for reproductive outcomes. So the important solutions are disrupting root causes of criminalization of reproductive autonomy, especially racism, patriarchy, and class-based oppression. And then finally, insisting upon increasing access to abortion, period, and advancing reproductive justice without exceptions, without shame, as a matter of human rights and dignity. And that includes, I just want to be clear too, in terms of increasing access to abortion, that means both increasing access to abortion so it's easier for people who want to get abortion care within the medical system, whether that's abortion pills or procedures, are able to get that in the communities where they live, affordably or free, even better. But also making self-managed abortion more accessible, spreading the word about abortion pills, getting to a point where, right now we've got condoms in the buckets outside the LGBTQ resource centers. The women's centers, let's get abortion pills in those. And then abortion-specific values, no one should fear arrest, jail, or any other penalty for pregnancy outcomes or supporting someone who has decided to end their own pregnancy. Instead of targeting people for accessing the method of abortion that is best for them, we should make sure that people are able to access abortion where they need it and on their terms. So increase clinic-based access to care, repealing abortion restrictions, and cutting it out. We shouldn't play hard to get with abortion pills. Again, they're really safe, they're really effective. It's not rocket science to use them. The World Health Organization has an awesome protocol that people aren't stupid and they're able to figure it out. So with that, just some resources. I'll run through these again at the end, so I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And before we turn it over to more of a dialogue between all of the panelists, Erin, can you tell us a little bit more about how so often public health officials are complicit in the policing of bodily autonomy, as are social workers and as are mandatory reporters, like Devin talked about a little bit. So how do we shift this precedent when it comes to the intersection of public health and policing?
Yeah, and I just want to expand the question a little bit. I love the question, and I want to expand it a little bit to also just include medical professionals, because that actually has been the most common group that has led to the prosecution of people who've had self-managed abortion or been accused of. There are other cases that I didn't look up. I think one of the most fascinating things that's happening within the reproductive justice movement, specifically where we do work, is reproductive justice organizing that's taking place within professions. Some organizations that I want to lift up, there's a group called Social Workers for Reproductive Justice that are really applying that lens. And I think that's where more of this needs to go, is in terms of organizing within the professions themselves and setting up chapters and building networks and building best practices that can be shared out to others who are not part of that, sort of grassroots core of educators. There's also a fantastic group called Med Students for Choice that has chapters all over, and without getting into it, it's a total disaster in terms of what's being taught to medical students about reproductive health care because of the extreme bigotry that's in state laws. So they fight back against that, but also can help educate other students. And then if, when, how, lawyering for reproductive justice, also working within that field. So I think that's a really intriguing way to really build a groundswell for change.
Great, thank you so much. So we have gotten some serious knowledge dropped from our 4 panelists today. So first, I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for any of our panelists or a connection that you're seeing between these issues, please feel free to drop your question in the chat. So first, I want to turn the discussion to a question from Christian Chandler. This question is directed towards Ian specifically. So regarding your exploration of history of gay spaces, so Christian is an LGBT health researcher at Pitt, and they wonder if there is a history of after-hours bars in Missouri. This was the historical birth of queer spaces as suggested in the Mysteries of Pittsburgh. So can you speak to that a little bit, Ian?
I guess I'm not maybe 100% sure by what they mean by after hours bars, but if that's to mean bars that are maybe operating outside of the law in one way or the other, then certainly it's the case that many early queer gathering spaces in the early 20th century in the St. Louis area were like that. But in any case, we have records of queer gathering places that were liquor dispensing establishments and gay or lesbian bars, using the modern parlance, going all the way back to the first decade of the 20th century in St. Louis. So there's a long history, and a history that often meant circumventing laws that tried to close them.
Great, thank you. And I think, Christian, I think this is such a good question that can apply to all of our panelists in one way. I think that when your existence is policed and criminalized, and that when there are things that you just can't do, and you're often forced to take matters into your own hands and create spaces for yourself, create safe spaces, create services for your own community. So a question to any of the panelists, where do we see that happening? And how can we make sure that as we work to decriminalize bodily autonomy, how can we also lift up those community-driven efforts?
I can go ahead and start if that's okay. So just as a person living with HIV, I do a lot of organizing among other people living with HIV so that they can know that, you're a subject matter expert. Like, you have something that you can share. These situations that may have hurt or may have felt like the end of the world at one point can actually be used to transform like someone else's experience. So I try to pass that along as much as possible. But I want to affirm part of what you said. We do know that community responses led by community, are more effective. They're more cost effective, more impactful than services provided by any other organization. The thing is that, at least in my case, public health really is not funding that. They don't see the utility. They feel like you need to pay a white woman to serve Black gay men, all the time because she's non-threatening or she's pure, or I don't know what they see in her, but apparently they think she's really good at her job. But yeah.
Do any other panelists want to weigh in on how do we work to decriminalize our existence, and how do we also uplift community-driven efforts to thrive?
I would like to weigh in. I am speaking from a position of somebody who does community mutual aid with sex workers, as well as somebody whose politics is informed by anarcho-communism. So that's kind of the lens that I'm coming through. In my approach, I've found that because sex workers are basically barred access to most quote unquote legitimate means of assistance, being that many of us don't have reportable income, don't have like a formal employer, or otherwise like can't access banks or other financial institutions in the ways that people who are not criminalized in the way that we are can. Mutual aid networks and community knowledge and wisdom is a really important part of sex worker survival, in the way that when one of us is assaulted physically, sexually, or stalked, we aren't really able to turn to the police, nor do we want to turn to the police. And this is even more the case for sex workers of color, and trans sex workers and drug using sex workers. And so we need to support each other in a direct way. And often the organizations that even try to extend the idea that they would help us don't, unless we identify as victims of trafficking. And so instead of, I think one of the lessons of this for in terms of sex work and in terms of liberating us all from the police state and the criminalization of entire classes of people, is that kind of you can't use the master's tools to take down the master's house. And our communities are strong, and when we communicate and we uplift each other, we are stronger together. But also we can always use the strength of folks outside the community, like sex worker mutual aid funds often run out of money before we can meet our community's needs because of the intense environment of criminalization. And so I think that instead of looking to big nonprofits or government orgs, like we need to be looking at what's going on our own blocks, and how do we uplift the people that are right in front of us, instead of turning to, like Devin said, like the safe white woman who is able to be the gatekeeper of these issues, but actually getting to know our communities and our communities' needs.
Great, thank you. Devin, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to acknowledge that, you know, we're in the moment of Black Lives Matter. I've been saying that all day. So there are movements taking place, but I don't feel like, sometimes I don't feel like HIV has really been included in the way that it really could be to make some real change happen. I want to give you all, I'm going to introduce you all to MIPA, Meaningful Involvement of People Living with HIV, just as a framework. And also one of the issues that we see is in public health, the only models of community engagement that a lot of people know is like health department type. It's always structured like a research project where you want to reach as many people as possible and not really support the leadership development of people living with HIV or community members.
Great, thank you, Devin. And Erin, I see that you unmuted. Would you like to weigh in as well?
I would. I want to, Indigo said it all perfectly. I want to lift up something that recently happened on this issue of specifically national organizations weighing in. So there was an incident that people may or may not be aware of where it was in my bio. I was with the National Organization for Women. I want to be very clear. I vehemently disagree with what I'm about to say happened. But there was a bill to decriminalize sex work in the District of Columbia, and the National Organization for Women weighed in and did exactly what Indigo said. That, you know, made it about trafficking. Like it was a horrible white feminist display. But I also want to say there's two things if there are other white women listening on it. Like, one, cut that shit out and stop it. But then two, I'd also encourage folks to dig a little deeper and challenge the national organizations that are doing this, because what may not have been reported out was actually the DC Local Now chapter was supporting the bill. And what's happening is a lot of times, and that's another conversation, but I dig a little deeper because in fact, a lot of times when that is happening, there isn't the support there that there seems to be. And so the first and foremost, the most important thing is to lift up the organizing of sex workers. I think that's like the perfect example of just this broader topic of how do we do this from the grassroots. But I do think it's important to keep looking and dig harder and demand accountability.
Great, thank you. And another question that kind of emerged as you were all talking. So Ian talked about that with social movements and movements to decriminalize same-sex sexual activity and cross-dressing, as was referred to at the time. Eventually, elite social influencers started to view well-off and white queer people as assets, as contributing to society. And one thing that Indigo also mentioned that I think there's a connection there is that we're quick to stand up for so-called happy hookers. So the respectable, the sex workers that fit the bill of a respectable sex worker. And so can you all speak to respectability politics and how that plays into stigma and criminalization? And I can see that Devin has some things to say based on the look on his face. But can you all speak to respectability politics and either historically or right now, contemporarily, how that plays into all of this? And do we end respectability politics first and then decriminalize? Do we decriminalize and then end respectability politics? How does it all fit together, and what do we do next, or what have we seen happen throughout history?
I don't have to be first, but I'll jump in. So there's so many examples, but I'll just debating which one I want to give you, but I'll give you this one. I was at the International AIDS Conference in Amsterdam. A conflict arose because the International AIDS Conference for 2020 was planned in San Francisco, and the global communities, the global civil society organizations were not happy with that decision under the current administration, and given you know, the cost of living in San Francisco, the plan was to actually have the conference itself in San Francisco and like the community village area in Oakland, which is already, you know, that's ugly. So the networks of the civil society networks have been coming together to address this for a long time. But at the conference, the people from the US came together. We had coalitions of sex workers, people who use drugs, impacted communities, they came together. I was in the room and with their president, their new president, and the one white gay man who knew him, who knew the president, said, think about your legacy. How's this gonna impact your legacy? What's this gonna look like if you make the right decision now? And I'm sitting here like, you have all these Black women, you have all these, you know, people who are sex workers and drug users sitting here saying the exact same thing, but all he listens to is, think about your legacy. It was so insulting.
Thank you, Devin. Do any of our other panelists want to respond to Devin or respond to the question around respectability politics and what class and racism all have to do with stigma and criminalization.
I can respond on just to the question regarding, well, first off, Molly, you said, like, should we focus on ending respectability politics or criminalization? Like, these things go hand in hand, right? And so in particular, when we're fighting against criminalization, like, let's not pick the low hanging fruit of like, oh, this makes the pearl clutchers feel comfortable about it. But I think as far as reproductive oppression goes, I mean, we need to be very clear about what we're up against, and we should not play into that system. What this is really about, restrictions on abortion are about white supremacy, and specifically the aim of abortion restrictions is to force white women to have more children because white men are concerned about demographic shifts in this country. At the same time, I don't want to center white women, that's what they want. At the same time, it is people of color who are most hurt by these restrictions, and they do not care about that collateral damage at all. So there's absolutely no reason to stand up for that system when resisting the criminalization.
I'd like to chime in response to kind of like the temporality of do we shed ourselves from respectability politics first and decriminalize later, or decriminalize first and shed respectability politics later. I think there's some really exciting organizing going on both in the state of Missouri right now, shouting out the Moho Justice HOOP, but also in New York and DC, as mentioned with that kind of spat that went on with Now DC and Now National and their initiatives. But I think that there's a lot of really dynamic sex work organizing going on right now that is trying to do it all kind of all at the same time, in the sense that our ask isn't so much like, oh, look how respectable we are contributing members of society, we do capitalism really well, we are concerned with the same like vice panic values that you have. Like, that's not the approach and the ask that we're making right now. It's recentering the inherent dignity of a person who trade sex for money, for drugs, for shelter, because we're out here in a world that has been set up to harm us, who has been set up to exclude us, and has been set up to kill us. And we're not standing up for that anymore because we're inherently dignified people and our work has dignity, regardless of whether somebody's like, and I'm gonna just name like very conservative Christian values are in accordance with our lifestyle. And so I think that shifting the framing from we need to decriminalize because something is respectable and palatable to us, shifting the frame to we need to stop criminalizing people that might live or walk different paths from us just because they don't live up to some sort of like hierarchical standard that we've placed ourselves at the top of the pyramid of.
Great, thank you. And would any of the panelists like to add anything else or respond to anything that any of our other panelists shared today?
Ian, I'm just dying to know, what is a confidence man? It was on one of your slides.
I'm sure you've heard the expression con man. That's the origin of the expression, a confidence man. So someone who won the confidence of someone else through deception to cheat them out of money or something. Yes.
Great, thank you. Well, so if our panelists would like to share their call to action, whether that is to follow on social media or to join a coalition. We'd like to turn it back to our panelists to kind of wrap up. And if anything that we talked about today in any of these 4 areas piques your interest and you want to get involved, we want to make that possible. So Ian, if you would like to kick us off.
Sure, can I share a slide?
Yes, you may.
Okay. So I have to admit that sometimes as a historian and a historical researcher, I can feel like, oh, I'm just sort of cooped up in a dusty archive while people like Erin and Devin and Indigo are, out doing things in the present and really making a difference. I will say that when I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic about my work, I really think that doing history and recording history is important. It's a way of building community, of providing lessons for people in the present, informing our choices today and in the future. So with that, I'd encourage everyone to contribute to this Gateway to Pride initiative. It's really important to me that we build up a collection that really is reflective of the diversity of the experiences of LGBTQIA+ people in the St. Louis area, throughout the state of Missouri and Southern Illinois. So if anyone has something that they'd like to share, remember, it doesn't have to be from 10 or 20 or 50 years ago, it can be from yesterday, but anything that speaks to the experiences of LGBTQIA+ people, please let me know, get in touch with me. We're looking for objects, photographs, artwork, oral testimonies around all different sorts of aspects of the LGBTQIA+ experience here. So yeah, let me know.
Great, thank you, Ian. And I dropped that email address in the chat, so if you're interested to get in touch with Ian about sharing your story and sharing about your own history here in Missouri, please contact him. Indigo, I see that you and J-Marie, hi J-Marie, dropped some information on the MoHo Justice Coalition, so if you'd like to speak a little bit about that too.
Yeah, so that is the exciting organizing initiative that I alluded to before. We have folks, sex workers, folks from a variety of organizations, including J-Marie with the ACLU, myself with St. Louis SWAP, Metro Trans Umbrella Group, Stop the Bleed. There's a bunch of folks that are coming together to uplift sex workers in the state of Missouri and to push towards the decriminalization of sex work and also uplifting the lives and material conditions of sex workers in our state. So we have a bit.ly link, bit.ly/MO sex work, which is a survey if you're interested in plugging into the work that we're doing with monthly educational events and other opportunities for like outreach and other forms of organizing. We'd love to have you. So you can fill out that survey to get plugged in. And if you are a sex worker, know a sex worker, love a sex worker, we're getting out a survey to collect some data on the experiences of sex workers in our state. Takes about half an hour, and that's at bit.ly/MOSW for sex worker survey. So the links are in the chat, and then you can also follow us on Twitter, St. Louis SWAP, and at MoHo Justice, which is also on Instagram.
Great, thank you. And Devin, tell us how to plug into the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition.
You can easily use this slide right here on your screen. So obviously everybody found this webinar. I think that Molly is super accessible because she posted this, but also we have a really good Facebook page if you want to look up Missouri HIV Justice Coalition. So yeah, we're really accessible, especially here within the state. Outside of the state, we're good for conversation, or if you'd like to contribute to the work of really making sure that we're modernizing our HIV laws. A lot of this work is taking place in other states as well, so I want to acknowledge that. I want to say, I forget how many, I think it's like 26 states within the US have HIV-specific laws that need to be changed. I also want to mention again MIPA, meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, or MIPA. It can, those principles can be found online. I think AIDS United shares a lot of those documents. And I would like to encourage everyone to think about incorporating HIV criminalization modernization work into the greater movement to address criminality and over-policing within our community.
Great, thank you, Devin. And Erin, if you want to remind folks how to get involved with Reproaction and your work.
Sure thing. So I'm sharing my screen. So reproaction.org is our website. If you want to view more of our videos, please do and share them. Stop Prosecuting Abortion campaign is at reproaction.org/stop. We have an amazing new petition, Abortion Pills Are Magic, which you can sign. It's right on our homepage. We have the World Health Organization protocol. Like I said earlier, this is easy to follow. So if you need resources on how abortion pills work or know someone who does, send them there. We have all sorts of stuff related to that. We host webinars every month, and so we'd love to have you there. A couple other organizations I want to lift up. Women Help Women does a lot of work around self-managed abortion with pills, and specifically has secure ways that people who are attempting to end their pregnancies can contact them securely. World Health Organization, If, When's, How, Repro Legal Helpline, and National Advocates for Pregnant Women. And I would be remiss not to mention our fabulous Missouri organizer, Evonnia Woods. If you want to, do amazing actions locally, get in touch with Eva. She's Evonnia at reproaction.org.
And speaking of Evonnia, take us home.
Yes, we're getting out of here early, folks. I want to thank most of y'all for staying on time, because we told you 15 minutes in anticipation that you would go over, because when people are passionate about their topics, that's what tends to happen. So we were like, everybody gets 20 minutes, but we'll tell them 15. So I want to thank y'all for surprisingly staying within that 15 minutes, which I know can be very difficult to do. I also want to thank everybody for attending. We'll be sending out a link to if you registered, whether you were able to attend or not. And we'll also be sharing this link on our social medias. So the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition will be showing the link, sharing the link publicly, and Reproaction will be sharing the link publicly as well. Also, this event was co-sponsored by Reproaction and the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition. We're also honored to have the Missouri Historical Society and the Moho Justice Coalition join us today. And please, follow our social medias, because that's how you'll be able to keep up with what we're doing. And I want to ask everybody to just, stay tuned for our next webinar in October. Bye, everyone.